Ladies and gentlemen, a new version of Minecraft Bedrock Edition has been released. That is, what used to be called Pocket Edition and Windows 10 Edition, and a couple of other names too, is now simply called Minecraft, but also named Bedrock. So we'll call it the Bedrock Edition to avoid any confusion here. This is version 1.2 of that one, what is known as the Better Together update. With this version, we are welcoming some console players to this version of the game as well. And if you're new to the Bedrock Edition from the console editions, you might find that it has a fair bit of differences from what you're used to. This is a massive update. It contains a huge amount of changes and I won't have time to go through every single little bug fix in this video, but I've gathered all of the major ones and we'll go through them here. To make things a bit simpler, I've divided them into sections. We'll be going through blocks and items first, then mobs, changes to world generation, the way worlds work, changes to the gameplay of the game, then redstone, user interface changes, audio stuff, and then we'll round off with commands, add-ons, and other technical changes. If you want to skip directly to a section, in the video description you'll find the timecodes that you can click on to get right there. In addition to all of this, there's also performance fixes, stability fixes, and tons of other bug fixes. Like I said, you won't hear all of it here. And if you want an even longer list, there is a changelog available, and I will link that in the video description as well. Let's get going with blocks and items. The block that everybody has been waiting for has finally been added to the game. This version of the game now has Coarse Dirt. Oh, and there's also stained glass in this version. With stained glass, a lot of work has been done in the game to how transparent blocks are rendered, and that means that other blocks have now been fixed too. So ice blocks are now transparent as well, and jungle leaves are now transparent if you have a powerful enough device, and fancy leaves are enabled in your settings. There are other new things as well. Banners have been added to this version of the game. They are crafted just like they were in the Java edition before, and both stained glass and banners will now spawn naturally in end cities. More things, more blocks and items added. The Jukebox is here and music discs are available as well. And there are now armor stands in this version of the game. Other items that have been added, fireworks now exist in the Bedrock version of the game, and just as in Java edition, they can now be used to boost your wings when you're flying around on Elytra. Another item that has been added, the Book and Quill. If you're used to the Java edition Book and Quill, then this one might strike you as a little bit more fancy. This one looks a bit nicer and has a lot more bells and whistles than that one. There are also a number of bug fixes and tweaks to blocks and items in this version. Empty maps can now be combined with a compass on an anvil to create a locator map, and locator maps now track the owner's position regardless of dimension. Maps can now be held in the offhand and they will show the heads of players' skins on them as players move around on them. Mycelium has had a fix, so it no longer turns to dirt when there's a giant mushroom above it. The non-plain versions of stone, diorite, andesite, and granite can no longer be used as a replacement for stone in crafting recipes. And a couple of fixes to shulker boxes. Their opening and closing animations are now much faster. And they now change their collision box when they are opened. Let's move on to mobs. There's a single new mob in this version of the game. It is the parrot, has been brought in from Java edition and now exists here as well. Parrots live in jungles and you can find them there. They come in 4 different versions, and like Java edition, they can be tamed by feeding them seeds, and when tamed they will sit on your shoulders sometimes. Don't feed them cookies, however. Chocolate is poisonous to parrots, and chocolate cookies will make their stomachs hurt. Other mobs have had some bug fixes and tweaks done to them. If you sheared a sheep and then killed it, it would drop wool even though it was already sheared. That is no longer the case. Villagers have had a bunch of fixes. They now spawn with a full range of professions when they spawn in the world, and you can no longer fool the villagers by giving them charcoal when they are trading for coal. They also now learn to close doors to stop getting themselves attacked by zombies all the time. If you find a skeleton horse, you can now put a saddle on it and ride it. There are a number of changes to the hostile mobs as well. Ghasts will no longer shoot fireballs when they are further away than you can see. And the ghast fireballs can now set obsidian on fire and that way they can also open nether portals. So if you're stuck in a nether without a flint and steel, then maybe that is a hint for you. Endermen that have picked up a block and get killed will now drop the blocks that they had stolen. Also, lingering water bottles will now deal damage to enemies that take damage from water, that is blazes, endermen, and snow golems. A bunch of changes to creepers in this version. Creepers now flash properly when they're about to explode, and they start hissing a little bit earlier now. The damage that they deal has been slightly decreased, and if they lose you as a target, they will now stop exploding, just like in Java Edition. They can no longer stop themselves from exploding if you light them on fire with a flint and steel, however. Bunch of fixes to shulkers as well. Shulkers can no longer be set on fire, and they will now teleport out of water if they end up inside water. If you have a shulker spawn egg, you can now spawn a shulker upside down by pointing on the bottom side of a block. And when they teleport around, they will no longer be able to teleport into a block where there is already another shulker. Some other random fixes for mobs. The wither's heads will now look around more, and it will shoot skulls from multiple heads. And the Guardians and Elder Guardians' laser attacks can now penetrate armor to damage you. Mob spawning has had a bunch of fixes as well. Hostile mobs could spawn inside of well-lit areas sometimes, that has been fixed in this version. And several issues with excessive mob spawning and despawning have been fixed. Monster spawners will now spawn at most 4 monsters at a time. Skeletons, strays, and zombie pigmen now have a chance of spawning with enchanted gear and weapons just like in the Java Edition. And squid will now properly spawn in oceans. In terms of general mob behavior, there are a few fixes to pathfinding and tracking. Mobs will now avoid cacti, fire, and lava, and they can no longer detect players through solid and non-transparent blocks. Finally, the zombie villagers have had their own spawn egg added to the creative inventory. Let's talk a little bit about changes to the world. There are now ravines in randomly generated worlds. The long requested ravines have finally made it over to this version of the game. There's another change to how the world behaves too. The temperature now decreases with height, and at high elevations it will now snow. And speaking about weather, lightning will no longer strike from a clear sky. That is to say, there will no longer be lightning in biomes that don't have rain in them. There are new options in the world start screen. You can now select a bonus chest, a starting map, and set player trust levels. Some other changes to the gameplay of the game. Block placement speed now matches your movement speed. This makes it a lot simpler to build while you're moving around, so no more trying to match your click speed with how much you move. Together with this, walking and sprinting are now both a little bit faster, and if you're brushing up against a block when you're sprinting, the sprinting effect will only stop if you directly hit a block. Another change to the speed of the game is that mining speed, when you have haste 2 and efficiency 5, have been increased to its correct speed. A version of the recipe book has been added to this edition of the game. It is not quite the same as either the recipe book from the Java edition or the crafting from the console editions before it, so you will have to explore this one to get used to how it feels. Another gameplay change is that blaze powder is now required to fuel brewing stands, just like in the Java edition. If you have brewed stuff and you drink a potion of water breathing and a potion of night vision and go underwater, it will now be much easier to see. Boats will now slip and slide faster on top of ice surfaces. And there's another fix to boats. If you were in a boat with another mob inside of it and you left that boat, it would keep going the way it went with the speed it had. That bug is fixed now, so mobs will no longer be able to run away with your boat. If you're riding a minecart, you can now eat while you're doing that, or shoot things with a bow. If there are several items of the same type in the same area, they will now collect into a stack of items, just like they do on Java Edition. This is very good for performance when there are many items on the ground, like during wither fights. A couple of fixes to the fishing mechanic. When you are fishing, the bobber will now submerge and play the right sound when a fish bites. And fishing now uses the proper loot tables, so you can correctly acquire enchanted items and books. And while speaking of fishing, you can now properly stick a fishhook into a mob. A fix for enchanting. The available enchants on an enchantment table will no longer switch when you reload a world. And a fix worth mentioning is that there was an item duplication in the game that could happen when you had the Pocket user interface enabled. If you're instead using a controller, the button mapping has been redesigned and there's now a pick block function available if you're using the controller as well. This is the function that is on the middle mouse button or on clicking the scroll wheel on your mouse if you're playing with the keyboard and mouse. Finally, there are a bunch of new achievements and a couple of the old ones have been fixed so that they can now unlock. That is Great View from up here and Organizational Wizard. Let's talk about Redstone. Pistons have had a bunch of fixes done to them. They can now push arrows and will remain extended if you reload the world. Glazed terracotta blocks can now be pushed, but no longer be pulled by sticky piston, so they now match the behavior on Java Edition. Observers have had some fixes too. They now have updated textures and will blink red when they output a redstone signal. The strength of that redstone pulse has been increased and they no longer pulse twice if they observe a retracting piston. Couple of fixes to hoppers as well. The hoppers will no longer pull items from the side when there is a full block above them, and they will now only send redstone signals directly upwards. Pressure plates will now require that a mob or player stands on top of them. Previously they could sometimes activate when they were standing next to them. And trapdoors will now open if you place them right next to an active power source. Comparators have been fixed so they now test for all valid power sources, and they will no longer trigger a short pulse when you place them next to a detector rail with a minecart on top of it. Droppers can now dispense into another container when that container has all of its slots filled, but there are items in it that are stackable and can be filled in from the dropper. And finally, redstone dust can now be placed on top of sea lanterns and on glowstone. In the user interface, there are some news as well. There are new loading screens, they have some helpful tips displaying on them while the game loads in. And there are a large amount of new options. There are in-game host options, you can toggle the selection outline, whether you want to see in-game names, the opacity of the user interface in the game. There are new Xbox Live multiplayer world settings, and you can select whether to render clouds and fancy leaves in the video settings. There's also a paper doll viewer setting that switches on the paper doll in the corner of the screen. This is what you're probably used to if you've been playing the console editions. You can see your own character and the state of it. You can also now mute chat messages and change skins from inside of the pause menu. There's also a new how to play screen with some helpful info if you're just starting out in the game. When you pick up an item that ends up in a slot on your hotbar, that slot will now animate, and if you hide the user interface you will no longer see the block highlighting. And by the way, the button for hiding the user interface, F1 if you're on a keyboard, will now also work when you're riding inside of a boat. Let's talk a little bit about sound and music audio fixes in this version. There has been a rebalancing pass. Most of the sound effects and music has been rebalanced for a more pleasant experience, such as rain being much quieter than it was before. And then there is a bunch of new sounds and fixes for sounds that weren't working. Walking sounds for mobs, for instance, can now be heard again. The sound effects for creeper explosions have been changed, and the sounds for placing Eyes of Ender into a portal frame and opening the end portal have been added. Proper sound effect will now play if you're looking directly onto an Enderman. And the Wither, when you summon it, will no longer play multiple overlapping sounds at once. If you're traveling into the Nether, the travel sound effect will now play when you exit another portal on the other side. And there's also fixes for some mismatched sounds when trading with villagers. Finally, some of the pets have had their sounds fixed. There was a missing wolf idle sound, and cats can now purr again. Last section of this video is going to be about commands, about add-ons and other technical stuff. This version of the game contains a completely new command parsing system. I could speak at length about exactly what this means because I made it. But this video is getting long enough already, so we'll save that for another video. Here are 3 of the most important things about this new command parsing system. It was made to improve the performance of running complex commands. If you're running lots of commands or complex executes, then this version of the game should perform significantly better. It also adds a whole bunch of the selector arguments that were missing from Java Edition, like selecting a player by level or by rotation. Finally, there is a new way of specifying positions. Relative locations have been specified by tildes a long time, but there's also another character that can be used to specify a different type of relative position in this version. That is the caret. If you use a caret, you will be specifying an offset in the local coordinates of the entity that you are running the command from. This means that you are not talking about x as a certain direction in the world, but x as a certain direction relative to the entity. What we're talking about here is x always being right and z always being forwards. Some general fixes when talking about commands. Players with operator status will now receive messages about commands that were entered by another operator, just like on Java Edition. And setting the send command feedback game rule to false will no longer prevent you from getting info out of commands that are only meant to give you info, such as /list and /help. There are new game rules in this version as well. There's a game rule for showing coordinates, there's a game rule for TNT explosions, and there's a game rule for natural regeneration, meaning that ultra hardcore mode will now be available in this version as well. There's a new command in this version as well. It's called /ticking area, and it is used to create areas that will still update when there are no players around. This is a little bit similar to the spawn chunks that you can find on Java Edition, but these are areas that you can specifically control, switching them on and off as you wish. Another addition is a new argument to the /teleport or /TP commands. It now has an optional facing argument that you can use instead of specifying rotation. When you use this argument, you can give the command a single entity or a position in the world that the target of the command should be facing once the teleport has been completed. Bunch of bug fixes to other commands as well. Large chests will now clone correctly with the /clone command, and when using the /clone command, overlapping chests will now have their contents replaced rather than merged. /replace item would sometimes make it impossible for you to change inventory slots. That is now fixed. And the hide particles argument for the /effect command will now properly hide particles of the selected status effect when it's set to true. Some other fixes related to commands. Evocation fangs can now be summoned using commands, and shulkers can now be teleported using commands. If you use the pick block function on a repeating command block and then place that block down again, now it will properly activate repeatedly. And there are a couple of updates to the add-on formats as well. You can find updated resource and behavior packs for vanilla on minecraft.net/add-ons. I'll put a link to that in the video description. Finally, the spawn_entity subcomponent of the Minecraft::interact component now work as intended. And that gets us to the end of this very long list of changes for Minecraft Bedrock Edition version 1.2, the Better Together update. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please help me out, leave a like, share it to your friends, and leave a comment of what you thought down in the comment section below. My name is slicedlime, thank you for watching, and I'll see you later. Take care.